Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today's webinar. My name is Daniela Simoni, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. Today we are presenting Rail System Cybersecurity Network Engineering to Simplify TSA Directive Compliance, presented by Andrew Ginter, the VP of Industrial Security, and Chris Crawford, Transportation Industry Director at Waterfall Security Solutions. A couple of housekeeping notes before I turn the webinar over to Andrew. This webinar is being recorded, and you will all get an email in a couple of days with the link to the recording. Andrew and Chris will be taking your questions at the end of the webinar. Please do submit your questions. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time to submit the question. Now, let's turn the stage over to our speakers, Andrew and Chris.
Okay, thank you, Daniela. I'll say just a sort of another word about Chris and my background. You know, as you said, Chris is our transportation industry director. He brings to Waterfall a long history of automating rail systems, deploying rail system automation, of deploying cybersecurity programs for rail systems, and for that matter, for airports as well. You know, I'm the VP Industrial Security. I lead a small team of subject matter experts at Waterfall, and you know, we work with the world's most secure industrial sites. And so, you know, the insights that you know, I'm presenting here are not insights that I made up. This is what I've learned from Waterfall's customers, from the people who are on the front lines of securing critical infrastructures and rail systems. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about the new TSA directives for rail cybersecurity, but really those directives, almost word for word, big chunks of the directives are almost word for word taken from the pipeline directives. So I'm going to give a quick history of what happened with the TSA and the pipelines after the colonial attack, and lead into, you know, where did these rail directives come from? Next slide, please. So you can see here, you know, on the far left, we see the standard we're talking about in bold. You know, the first one that's sort of relevant, there was in 2021, before the colonial incident, there was a guideline put out by the TSA for pipelines. Next slide, please. Oh, and if I may, the guideline had, you know, two sort of important sections. Section 5 talked about segmentation and criticality, asset criticality. And Section 7 talked about the usual cybersecurity measures, use some passwords, you know, antivirus, the sort of a conventional cybersecurity program. And then the Colonial Pipeline incident hit. You know, the nation's largest gasoline pipeline was down for 6 days. You know, lineups at gas stations, you know, people being injured because they're trying to, you know, put gasoline into garbage bags because they don't have storage, you know, facilities properly. You know, a huge impact on the society. And next slide, please. You know, the reaction, sort of a knee-jerk reaction out of the TSA. This was a matter of weeks later, a handful of weeks later. They came out with a directive to the nation's largest pipeline. Did not apply to all the pipelines, applied to only the largest, and said that guideline that you saw at the beginning of the timeline here, it's a regulation now. For you, you have to do this. Compare your system to what's in the guideline, give us a gap analysis, explain to us how you're going to close those gaps. Next slide, please. You know, another sort of half dozen, 9 weeks after that, we're talking July 19th, the TSA directive 2021-02 came out. I mean, the numbering of the TSA directives, as you can see there, 2021 is the year the directive was issued, and 01-02 is the number of the directive. And later on, as you'll see, when you have different versions of 2021-02, they'll be called 2021-02B and C. It's the original year of release. So there were two directives that came out. One that said, use the guidelines, they're rules now. and one that was very different that said, a bunch of stuff I'm going to go through in just a minute, but because they were very different, they were given different numbers, 01 and 02. So this is how they do it. The directive was originally confidential. It was not released to the public for official use only. As you can see, the photo of the directive on the bottom, the Washington Post accessed a copy of the directive under a Freedom of Information request, and a redacted version of the directive was released. So this is how I know what was in it. And it had a bunch of immediate requirements. You must immediately reset all of your passwords. You must immediately look at your administration accounts. If you have an account that has unusual privileges, an admin account of some sort, have to review who has access to those passwords, determine whether they still need access to those passwords, get rid of those permissions if they don't need them, and change the password with a whole bunch of other requirements. It was seen by the industry as really, what's the right word? It was very detailed, very demanding. You have to do this stuff, even if some of this stuff was really very hard to do in the industrial network. Next slide, please. And that document had wording in it that carried through right into the Rails document. And the wording was about segmentation. Basically, the wording said, you will keep the critical infrastructure working at the capacity the society demands. They didn't say that. They said necessary capacity. But what's necessary? It's necessary to society. You will keep providing necessary service to society, even when your IT network is compromised, which means you have to be able to separate your OT network from your IT network. This is in the directive, so that if the IT network is compromised, the compromise does not leak into the OT network. You must identify interdependencies. If your physical operation depends on systems in your IT network, then if your IT network is crippled, you have to shut down operations, don't you? That's not acceptable. When your IT network is crippled, you are expected to keep the OT system running at necessary capacity. And there was a bunch of extra rules that went into that IT-OT interface. Really, what is the IT-OT interface? It's the boundary between the control critical automation system and the business automation that you see on the IT network. At that boundary between two networks that have very different consequences of compromise, the directive said you've got to do extra intrusion detection, you've got to do extra protections of a number of kinds. I mentioned that on the bottom already. You have to be able to completely separate. So these were very strong requirements, and the high level requirement was you will keep operations running. And then they said, and I said, I looked at that and I said, wow, I've never seen that said before. This was new to the world. I've never seen a cybersecurity standard say you will keep operations running when IT is. I always assumed that was the goal, but it was said explicitly. And then it said, and I looked at that and I said, that's going to be hard to do in all cases. They did not give any leeway in that directive. And then they said, here's how you do that. And they said, here's a bunch of specific, when you have an incident, you have to be able to separate IT and OT. And I said, okay, so basically the pipeline operators have to a degree been let off the hook. If they do the specific measures, then it's assumed they will achieve the goal of keeping operations running. And exactly, or almost exactly, this wording we're going to see in just a moment is in the Rails. Next slide, please. 2022 came a new, only a 6-page document, and it was not a security directive. It was guidance. It was saying, the most important pipelines. It was something, I'm told there was something like 12 or 14 pipelines in the nation that had to do the security directive. And all the other pipelines got this information circular saying, could you please designate a primary and an alternate security manager if there's an incident, so that we have somebody to call. Can you please report incidents? So these were guidance for everybody else outside of the 12 or 14 pipelines. Next slide, please. And then the next year, 2021-02B. So this was the second version of 2021-02 came out, and it was essentially identical to the first version, but it was no longer confidential. Next slide, please. And then the third version of that directive came out, and I read I don't know, when I read a standard or a regulation like this, I generally can't be bothered to read the introduction. I go straight to the meat and say, what do people have to do here? So I read through the meat and I said, the meat of the directive looks like it's been softened just a little. Instead of saying you will eliminate all interdependencies between IT and OT, they said you will eliminate all interdependencies, and if you can't, then you have to document the remaining interdependencies, and you have to explain to the TSA how you're going to keep the pipeline running, even if IT is compromised in light of this interdependency. You will update your passwords on a regular basis, unless you can't, in which case you will report the systems that you can't update the passwords on and explain what you're going to do. So there was some leeway for compensating measures introduced. And then I went back and I read the introduction, and it basically said exactly that. It said this is the same as 2021-02A, which they renamed. It used to be 2021-02, now it's 02A because there's additional versions of it. And it's the same as that, only you've got, it's been expressed really as goals, and you've got sort of a recognition that some of this stuff is really hard to do on industrial networks. And you've got the option of describing compensating measures and taking measures to achieve the goal, which is keep operations running, even if you can't meet the letter of each one of these very challenging regulations. Next slide, please. The wording about you will prevent, you will continue operating even if IT is compromised, that wording is still in there. In fact, it was expanded. Instead of saying you will keep operations running even if IT is compromised, it said you will keep operations running even if IT is compromised, and you will keep the IT networks running even if operations is compromised. Mm-hmm. Why? I don't know, but that's the wording. So they sort of made it symmetric. They said you've got to identify your independencies. You've got to get rid of as many as you can. You have to put plans in place for the remainder. They said in particular, you have to review trust relationships. This was in the original. I forgot to mention it, but trust, when OT trusts IT, we're talking Active Directory. This is an opportunity for the bad guys to take over the Active Directory system on the IT network and use that system to create accounts for themselves and walk through the firewalls into the OT system. So they said these trusts are particularly dangerous. You must get rid of them all, unless you can't, in which case you have to document the remaining ones, and et cetera, et cetera. So, so this is, again, it's very similar to the original with sort of a little bit of softening, recognizing that some of this stuff is really very hard to do. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thanks you, Andrew. And one of the things that you may note from what Andrew has been highlighting is that the TSA had some trial and error to try to get the language and try to get some elements in place that not only they themselves could put towards the industry or the sector, but also that the sector would accept. And what we found is that experience led to much of that same language coming directly over into the rail directive. And in the rail directive, identify segmentation is unchanged here. Identifying those dependencies between IT and OT was also, as Andrew had mentioned, already matured in that thinking, to the point they brought it directly over into rail. And one of the things that it talks about is, again, trying to understand in the context of rail, which of course everyone knows in rail, it's already designed to be fail safe. I mean, the safety culture there is embedded. It's a safety culture that's taken 20 years to mature. And so the real question really became, how do you develop the network segmentation, not only to manage safe operations, but how do you do so in the context of the fact that we have business needs and the digitalization of rail and IoT in rail, for example, trying to get to efficiencies and optimization, and how do you do this in the context of these directives coming from the TSA?
So we're going to talk more about these directives. We're going to talk about how to deal with these directives. But I wanted to take a bit of a segue and ask the question, where is this coming from? Was it just colonial? And in my estimation, it's not. So Waterfall just published our 2023 threat report. The Waterfall threat report, it's available at the URL you see there. It documents cyber attacks, not errors and omissions, cyber attacks with physical consequences in the industries we track. So we track, process industries, we track manufacturing industries, we track critical industrial infrastructure, including, of course, rail systems. What we are observing is that, in the previous decade, the years 2010 through 2019, cyber attacks with physical consequences were quite rare. How many such attacks were there in 2010? There was one. It was Stuxnet. How many in 2011? It was 0. There was lots of attacks on critical infrastructure in 2011. None of them brought about physical consequences. There were no shutdowns. There was no damaged equipment. It was, arguably nuisance. That changed at the beginning of this decade. At the beginning of this decade, ransomware and hacktivist attacks started taking off. And these are attacks with physical consequences. And what we're seeing at this point is that the number of attacks with physical consequences in the industries that we track are, and I should say, these are attacks in the public record. There's no private disclosures here. You go into the threat report, go into the appendix, there's links where you can verify every one of these attacks yourself. So attacks in the public record are more than doubling every year, 2.5 times every year. You do the math and they're increasing tenfold every 2.5 years. They're going to increase 100. It's exponential. If this continues, they're going to increase 100-fold in 5 years. In the year 2027, we're going to see thousands of these attacks shutting things down, including rail systems. In a couple of years ago, Iran's rail system was shut down by a hacktivist who changed the passenger signage, and people couldn't find their trains in the station anymore. Most of the signage said the trains had been canceled, but they hadn't. There were outages in the Pacific Northwest in the United States. Belarus and Denmark suffered shutdowns. Most, half of these were I shouldn't say half. The Denmark was ransomware. The other 3, I think Pacific Northwest, the TSA report was ransomware. Belarus and Iran were hacktivist. Mm-hmm. Here's the thing. Most of these attacks, not all of them, most of them are ransomware. And ransomware, we observe, the ransomware criminal groups are using tools and techniques that less than 5 years ago were available only to nation states. Ransomware is running behind nation states by about 3 to 4 years. What does this mean for us? A lot of us have said, nation states, why would a nation state come after me? I'm not important enough for a nation state to come after. Here's the thing. What we see ransomware, what we see nation states doing to each other today, in a very short period of time, we're going to see ransomware doing to everyone with money. Do we have money? Then we are going to see nation state attack techniques coming after us in the hands of ransomware actors. So this is the Waterfall threat report, but we are reporting on what is in the public record. And so, we're not the only people aware of this. The TSA is aware that the threat environment is deteriorating and is deteriorating rapidly. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks. And I think one thing to bear in mind is that, as Andrew mentioned for the threat report, this is what's in the public record. And of course, those of us that are working directly with clients do understand that there are things that they do not put in the public record. And so if you see that threat report, just bear in mind, it's even broader than that because of what's not reported for various reasons. But regardless, the attacks on transit and rail transit are happening regularly, and they're in the news. You see here, incident March 21, 2021 reported by CSX, had a vulnerability in a file transfer subcontractor software. It's a 20-year-old file transfer product, obviously been used for many years, and the vulnerability was in the software, and it actually did affect some level of operations. In the case of the cyber attack you see in the center, this is 2023, October 24th, very recently, cyber attack affecting railroad, and this was Alaska Railroad, and attacked the internal network systems. It was a ransomware attack. And then we also saw in Honolulu in December of last year, an attack which affected multiple servers at the Oahu Transit Service. They also do, as you know, some of you may know from Oahu, quite a bit of bus, namely bus, because they're actually still in the process of turning up their first automated system there. But nonetheless, they were attacked, and attempts to correct it failed. Basically, they were not successful in logging into those servers, and it affected them quite a bit. So happening in the news regularly, and to support on the back of what I guess you could assess from the two timelines. One, if you looked at the timeline from the TSA and the directives and the maturity of the directives that are happening there affecting transit agencies. And then you also look at the number of attacks happening and the exponentiality of those attacks. Clearly, we as an industry in the transit industry are behind. You would prefer to see that maturity coming before you see such exponentiality on the attacks. But regardless, there are some fundaments that are being put forward, not only by TSA, but also by the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was recently released. And you see some of the 5 pillars that were here, including the very first one, which was a lot of focus, and it had much to do with the pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline attack and waking up, but it also had to do with the concern that some of the class 1s could be shut down and really truly affect the supply chain or what the class 1s were delivering to specific entities. So a lot of focus on the critical infrastructure, and it again confirmed that the nation state attack tools were being used by almost regular attackers now, and this was not common before. Pillar 1, as mentioned in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, was defend critical infrastructures. And one of the sentences that sticks out there, of course, in the context of what we're going to be trying to bring to your attention today, not trying, we are going to bring it to your attention today, is that regulators are very much focused on secure by design principles. And we all can recognize that, if you had a blank sheet of paper, you could, in fact, design something that was much more deterministic. And of course, that's true for many of us in rail who understand the safety culture and understand that deterministic behavior is something that you must have in the case of safety integrity levels. And it's the reason why there are those safety integrity levels up to SIL 4. But what you see in the National Cybersecurity Strategy is just this: regulators are encouraged to drive the adoption of secure by design principles for the essential services and fail safely and recover quickly. And I think this is gives you a sense that the focus is clear. And what may not be so clear is exactly how do you go about doing this. And so on the back of the TSA objectives and directives, as well as the regulatory, or the new national cybersecurity strategy, you see that there's a advance notice of proposed rulemaking by TSA and the Department of Homeland Security that is more or less saying to the industry, look, we put these objectives out, we put these directives out. Now let's reassess how are we going to meet the future threats and capabilities and the unknown capabilities that we don't even know yet. How are we going to go about doing that? And so they needed help to develop a comprehensive and forward-looking approach to this. And they wanted to maximize the ability for the owners and operators to meet the evolving technologies and threats. And you can see, and I encourage you to take a look at this advanced notice of public rulemaking. Not only does it pose questions to the industry, but it also, people have already begun to respond, and it gives you a sense of the thinking, the latest thinking in terms of how to go about this and that cooperation with the industry. What's clear in all of it is it's a cyber by design approach, much more focused on, again, that reiteration of the network segmentation. And of course, from where we would like to take the conversation today is to get rail engineering professionals who are already very familiar with deterministic behavior for safety systems into thinking about deterministic cybersecurity. And I just segue into this security engineering topic by saying, I met last year with an elderly signaling gentleman who had been in the industry 30 years working signaling systems, and basically said, we'll just air gap it. Just keep it air gap. That's the way we'll solve the problem. And you know, that's one approach. Certainly, you know, you could just air gap the signaling system or some of those very critical systems from anything else. The problem with that, of course, is that it doesn't address the needs of the business, because rail operators are always trying to optimize and do things more efficiently, because they're facing a physical cliff. You know, they are always having trouble to meet the new demands, while their ridership, particularly on passenger rail, is not necessarily coming back to pre-COVID levels. So they need the data from the signaling system or other essential systems to be able to optimize. And so what we will produce, or what we will demonstrate here, is that you can get to an air gap type of security with the unidirectional security gateway type of technology, which is much more deterministic in its behavior, and it meets these, let's call it, it meets the objectives and the mindset of inquiry that is going on to see how we will proceed in the future.
Yeah. So the bottom line here, in my estimation, is there's going to be more regulations. You saw the threat environment continuing to degrade. If that continues for another couple of years, it's inevitable that additional critical infrastructures in the rail industry, in other industries, are going to shut down, and there's going to be other emergency regulations coming through. You saw the US strategy saying we need to fix this, and putting a strategy together to fix it. But their requirements really are quite demanding. They said, look, it's unacceptable that a single honest mistake on the part of one employee, a momentary lapse in judgment, clicking on a bad link, clicking on an attachment, it's unacceptable that one honest mistake would put national security at risk. We need this fixed. So, and you saw the notice of proposed rulemaking. There's going to be more regulations. The question is, how can we get out ahead of this? As an industry, we cannot afford constant aggressive change to stay ahead of the bad guys. This is what you do on IT networks. This is the right way to model an IT network. It's the wrong way to model cybersecurity on an industrial network, on a rail automation network. And so what I am very encouraged by is a new initiative called Cyber Informed Engineering. This is something that came out of the Department of Energy, but Idaho National Labs is taking and broadening, and it's talking about deterministic cybersecurity. The classic example is not in the Rails. The textbook example of what is this is in power generation. If you're the technician responsible for, the boilers, coal-fired boilers in a large power plant with 5 boilers. Each of these boilers is 4 stories tall. You're producing 2.5 gigawatts of power out of these 5 generating units. If your job is to keep those boilers working with your inspection regime and your maintenance regime, you work inside the kill zone of a worst case disaster, a boiler explosion. How would you like to be protected against the consequences of a cyber attack that misoperates the furnace and causes the boiler to explode? Would you prefer a spring-loaded valve where if the boiler overpressurizes, a steel plate is forced against a spring, the pressure is released and there's no explosion? Or would you prefer a longer password on the PLC controlling the boiler? Most of us would prefer the deterministic. In fact, most of us would prefer a spring-loaded valve or 3, because these things have been known to fail, but they are unhackable. And so the strategy here is focused on activities, on tools that the engineering profession has had for decades, sometimes for a century, using physical design, using network designs, using protection designs to address not just physical risk, but cyber risk as well. Next slide, please. Some examples of what we're talking about here, if you want to look them up. The strategy is a strategy. It's not saying here's the body of knowledge that we need to apply. It's saying we need to develop a body of knowledge. And so what's going to be in the CIE body of knowledge is still under development. But in rail systems, you're very familiar with a lot of these techniques already. I just suggest the engineering teams in the rail systems have not been systematically applying these techniques into cybersecurity designs. We need to bring this all together. So some examples are security PHA review. If you've done an OSHA process hazard analysis, add a couple of columns to the spreadsheet, ask the question, the unacceptable consequence, the trigger conditions for the consequence, can any of the trigger conditions be brought about by a cyber attack? If so, we have a problem. And then you ask the question, look at the mitigations that are in place. Are all of the mitigations cyber mitigations as opposed to physical mitigations? If they're all cyber, we've got an unacceptable physical consequence that can be brought about by a cyber attack. And all of the mitigations are cyber mitigations, longer passwords, antivirus, blah, blah, blah. Now we need major cybersecurity to try and prevent a nation state or a ransomware actor using nation state tools coming in and doing this to us. Security PHA review says, guys, try to find a physical mitigation. Take these consequences off the table. Countering cyber sabotage mostly is about a risk assessment methodology, but it's also got some chapters in there on mitigation. And the mitigations they recommend are manual. They're saying, look, if you can operate the system manually, if you can turn off all of your computers in a cyber emergency and continue to operate the system, well, that's a powerful fallback. Even if the computers are crippled with ransomware or who knows what, we can keep operating the physical process. So manual operations is something we've all sort of moved away from, but maybe it makes sense to bring some of this capability back, not because it's the most efficient way to run the rail system, but because it is an important emergency fallback. So countering cyber sabotage has a bunch of examples of physical mitigations. Secure operations technology, this is the book I wrote a handful of years ago. It's talking about information flow engineering. It's talking about network engineering. It's talking about how to design networks and automation systems so that cyber attacks, certain entire classes of cyber attacks, become physically impossible. So those are some examples if you'd like to dig deeper into what's happening in the CIE space. And I suggest most of these approaches are worth applying right now. You don't have to wait for CIE to start, using these powerful tools. And one of the, you know, I'm going to be talking about network engineering. You know, why are we talking about network engineering? Because of the directive from the TSA, keep operations running, even if IT is compromised. Segment operations thoroughly enough so that you're able to keep operations running, even if the IT network is compromised. This is the nature of network engineering. And, you know, one of the principles, the fundamental principles of network engineering are very old. You know, look back at the pipeline guidance that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode here. It talked about asset criticality, determining network criticality, determining the kinds of security that we need in place. So, you know, think about it. A lot of us are saying, well, you know, our industrial networks, our rail system networks, our electric networks in metros, these networks, you know, are hard. Patching them is hard. Even putting passwords on them is hard. You know, antivirus on, how do you put antivirus on a PLC that's not running Linux or Windows? A lot of this stuff is hard. A lot of us, you know, a lot has been written about the difference between how you manage an industrial network and how you manage an IT network. But fundamentally, let's say we had a magic wand and we could wave a magic wand and patch absolutely everything in our industrial network, our automation network, and bring, you know, every operating system in that network right up to the latest standard. You know, put a long password on every device and encrypt absolutely everything. I know it's not going to work, but imagine we had that magic wand. There would still be a difference between the way we manage the IT network and the way we manage the automation network. And that difference has to do with consequence. What's the worst case consequence of compromise? If you mess with a switching system in a passenger rail system, it's a mass casualty event. What's the worst case consequence of compromise on a business network? Lawsuits because we've leaked personally identifiable information, you know, some downtime. We have to bring gurus in on an emergency basis and pay them through the nose to recover. The consequences on a business network are business consequences. We can buy insurance for that. The consequences on the automation network, even if we had the magic wand, are still unacceptable. We cannot restore human lives and damaged equipment from backups. So consequences determine the security measures, and at consequence boundaries, if you could go to the next slide, please. Consequence boundaries, this is the heart of network engineering. At consequence boundaries, this is where we have to take special precautions, get rid of interdependencies, get rid of shared trusts. These are the consequence boundary. They didn't use the word consequence boundary in the TSA Rails rules, but this is what they're talking about. And this is what the whole industry is saying, you know, we need to apply engineering techniques to produce network designs, as, you know, and other physical designs that deterministically prevent unacceptable physical consequences.
Thank you, Andrew. And so what we'd like to do now is go through some practical examples and use cases to demonstrate how to apply you know, this cyber by design approach with network segmentation at the criticality boundaries, at the boundaries of consequence, as Andrew had mentioned. And of course, in rail, we certainly prefer to have standards to support us, because at the end of the day, when the tendering process happens for systems under consideration, we would like to have some consistency and understanding between the vendor and, of course, the operator. And so we do see already that the industry, in let's say lockstep to some degree, happening in different timelines, but relatively the same time frame, is trying to address this. Many of you are familiar with the IEC 62443. What we see here is that PS 5701 was basically a standard put forward to address how to adopt IEC 62443 in the context of transportation, particularly bus and passenger rail. And it really started to identify this idea of the zones and the level of security per zone and then also identifying what you need to think about in terms of the consequences versus connectivity between these zones. And by way of just practically looking at an example here, as you can see this slide, railways are complex, and just to orient you a little bit on the slide, you see the red network, the blue, and the orange generally on the slide, with the train down at the bottom in the bottom left. What I just highlight for you is, if you had which many of you don't, I do recognize that, but it's always good to think about cyber by design. If you had a blank sheet of paper, the way you would design a system, and you design a system in a way that you would acknowledge, for example, that the red network would be, for example, your signaling a network. And Andrew had mentioned, of course, in rail, if you're able to affect the signaling system, there are physical consequences, potentially disastrous consequences that could occur there. And that's the reason why, even though that's a safety first by design system, the fact is that that system is being, let's say, there are elements of information and data from that system that's being demanded by business into other systems, like the blue network here, the operational control network. And so the signaling system being the red network, the blue and the top left here being operational control network, which still is an essential part of the rail system to operate, right? This is things like the PLCs, the building management system, the power, the power SCADA, the facilities SCADA. So clearly an important network, and distinctly different than the administrative control network in the top right, which would be more, have functions in it, for example, an ERP or email. And so when you look at the different networks here, you need to be thinking about, from a cyber by design approach, down to the level of, okay, these networks, let's start with the mindset that they're air-gapped as segmented networks, and then be very specific on what we need to actually share, and why, and do we really need to share information? Is it just that we need to share information but not control anything from an external source back into that specific zone or that specific secure network? And so by way of example, I'll just give, again, thinking about secure by design, and just pulling out of that previous slide the signaling control network, and pointing out that this one network is being designed typically in a greenfield as a completely isolated network, from the sense of its own fiber, its own communications network, its own servers, workstations, etc. And then obviously the question becomes, how do you manage the need from the business for the services like you see to the top left, either public access to mobile phones, to signage, passenger information displays, to passenger announcement systems, or for that matter, maintenance systems that need to have some status or information shared. And if you, again, had a blank sheet of paper, you could simply say, no problem, I've got a segmented network, I will just air gap, but if I need to actually have these systems connected, you need some technology that is unbreachable, is capable of sharing data, but not have any ability for the data or have any information flow coming from the public back into this secure network. Well, one such technology that exists and is quite mature at this point is the unidirectional security gateway. And so you can see here, if you were to place a unidirectional security gateway, and we'll go into a moment what the unidirectional security gateway, how it goes about this 100% unbreachable protection that goes beyond what we've seen previously from firewalls, is that it has a hardware and software element to it, that when the data flows from this secure network to the public access mobile phone or other software elements, intermodal software, giving for example, when a train is arriving at a particular station, or for passenger information systems or maintenance, allows that information to be transmitted to those and do so in a very secure manner. Now, granted, I just mentioned all of this in the context of a blank sheet of paper, but also, or a blank design, greenfield, in other words. But bear in mind that even in brownfield, given the fact that the TSA objectives and the movement of the regulatory bodies is much more towards network segmentation, many of you and many operators have already been going through the work to identify the assets, to identify what's actually happening, doing inventories, which they hadn't done to the level of detail that they needed to, or they were required to as a part of their assessment on the back of the TSA directives. That's the first step in terms of trying to determine, okay, which systems are speaking, which ones do I have, which ones need to be speaking to each other, and do they actually need to speak to each other, and in which way? Is it simply I need information in one direction? And what we find is when Waterfall has been speaking to many of these operators, railroad as well as passenger rail, we find that the mindset wasn't geared towards that understanding, meaning that you could actually think of things in a unidirectional way, that you could actually understand that once you went to the traffic flow level, you begin to understand that, you know what, I really only need to share information in one direction. And that's kind of a distinct element that we want to highlight. But how do you go about this unidirectionality?
Yeah, so let me chime in here. There are many techniques for network engineering, but the unidirectional gateway is the most widely used technique at this point. It is deterministic. Under the hood, there are circuit boards. The circuit board on the left of the diagram here, in the unit, has a fiber optic transmitter, a laser. The circuit board on the right has a receiver. The circuit board on the right has no laser in the logic. It's not physically possible to send anything back into the industrial network. You can send stuff from the industrial network out to the enterprise network and nothing gets back. With a firewall, you hope that the firewall does not let anything back. With a unidirectional gateway, it's not physically possible for the gateway to send anything back. There is no laser on the receiving circuit board. It's deterministically one way. The only way to hack it is to go up to it with a hammer. The software, in a sense, is where the magic is, because the software makes copies of servers and emulates devices. If we have a bunch of devices that we are polling for data on the left, the gateway polls the devices or polls the OPC server, gets back registers and values, gets back tags and values, takes that snapshot of data, pushes it through to the outside network, usually an enterprise network. This is usually deployed at the IT/OT interface. And on the enterprise network emulates the original devices. Somebody on the enterprise network wants one of those values. Normally, they would connect to the device, put the device at risk by connecting to it and asking it a question. Instead, they connect to the emulated device inside the head of the gateway, and the gateway provides the same answer as the device would have. So this is, again, a way to share information from operations out to the world, to benefit, to profit from access to that information, which we cannot do in an air gap, but do so without putting operations at risk. Next slide, please. This is just sort of what it looks like under the hood. It is deterministic. There's a physical divider down the center. There are no cross connects inside. The only cross connect, you can see on the front of the unit. You run your finger down this divider, you can verify visually there's no cross connect inside, and the fiber is the only cross connect outside, and it can only go one way. Next slide, please. And this is a mature technology. As I said, it's the most common kind of network engineering today. There are a lot of connectors available to make copies of different kinds of systems, to emulate different kinds of devices, new connectors being written all the time. Many of these connectors can run at the same time in the device. You don't need a separate device for every connector. It's a mature technology that connects to just about everything. And, if it doesn't, it will soon. Next slide, please. And, the other aspect of it is, again, it's a mature technology. It's been around for a long time. It behaves in every way the way that you expect a network appliance to behave. It shows up with a firmware image. If you want to update it, you update the firmware image. If you want to configure it, you connect to the web-based user interface, you log in, username and password, encrypted connection, and up comes a web user interface that you can use to configure the device, to manage the device, to monitor the device, even to troubleshoot the device. It all happens through the web. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so I just highlight, again, through that unidirectionality from a design perspective, we can look at specific use cases for rail and understand the type of information that would need to flow. And I think this is the quite important point to get to the level that you're not just talking about it from a pure communication standpoint, meaning a networking standpoint, network communication standpoint, TCP/IP, or is it just I've got one segment here or another segment here. This is about what data you need from what system to ensure your operations, so that you can actually isolate or segment those functions. And if you have such a dependency between, for example, those types of systems that you must have bidirectionality, then you might consider bringing that into a segmented network that obviously is at the level of security that you require. So take a look at some of these. I won't go through every one of them. You'll receive this as a part of the feedback from the webinar. But basically, if you look at the signaling system, real-time train location information clearly is needed by a lot of other types of systems, including those potentially by the transport agency, whether that be national or whether that be regional. Intermodal applications, for example, from the mobile phone, trying to get information about the exact train location, timetable and calendar. If you have an operation where the security event information, the alerts from there are in some CSOC, Cybersecurity Operational Control Center, which is on the IT side, you would need your CM information to be populated across the unidirectional or the criticality boundary from the signaling network into that less secure IT network. Asset maintenance information, and just triggered events in general for, let's say, passenger information systems or announcements. And to take that one step further, just to highlight this idea of looking at things from an inventory, if you will, of the actual traffic flows, you would begin to look at the source segmented network. In this case, on the left-hand side, you see signaling control network, destination, the operational control network, if you'll refer back in your mind to that diagram I had showed previously. And you look at, well, we need syslog to be able to send CM information over to the Cybersecurity Operational Control Center. We definitely need that information. So that can be unidirectional in its approach. And you're assured that by doing it through this type of technology, that sharing that information does not open up an attack vector or vulnerability. Likewise, the network management system. You see the application here, SNMP traps being forwarded to a network operational control center. Or for that matter, you see maintenance information being sent across to the operational control network, and so forth. Shift management files as well. And I'll just point out briefly that unidirectionality can be managed in a way, again, in a deterministic way. So when you decide how you want to manage the data flows, and that's what we do with Waterfall and with our clients, we will go through with them if they need help. Some of them can do it already themselves, but if they need help, it's about looking at the specifics of the protocols, looking at the specifics of the flows, and then demonstrating that either marries up with the connectors that are already mature that Andrew had showed previously, or for that matter, we can work with you to decide that's a protocol that we can manage, and we will build a connector for that. So at the end of the day, the point is about the data flows. Once you get to that point, you're at the point of being able to decide how you want to manage in a deterministic way.
A few words about Waterfall, if you'll indulge me. We invented the unidirectional security gateway. We've been around for 15 years. We have sites all over the world in all critical industrial infrastructures, including a lot of rail systems, and a lot of other industries. Next slide, please. And the summing up here, in my estimation, new regulations are inevitable. The threat environment is deteriorating rapidly. The demands from government agencies about critical infrastructure keeping running are increasing. The key demand out of the TSA is keep physical operations running at necessary capacity, even if the IT network is crippled. And that is all about network segmentation. And as an industry, we have a choice. We can either react to these regulations as they change every year or 2 or 3, constantly changing our security programs, which is going to be extremely expensive. We all know how difficult it is to change anything in these very sensitive industrial networks. Or we can get out in front of it with engineering grade deterministic protection. This is the industry that created the term engineer. This is the industry that created engineering grade protections. This is the industry that's been doing it for the longest. Let's get out ahead of these regulations by putting engineering grade mitigations in for safety conditions, for network engineering, so that nothing gets into our networks to put them at risk. I mean, fundamentally, all cyber sabotage attacks are information. That's the definition of cyber sabotage. The only way that a control system can change from a normal state to a sabotaged state is if attack information enters the system. If we have engineering grade deterministic mitigations in place to prevent attack information entering the system, we have a security program, a security posture that is going to stand the test of time. This is what I suggest we need to consider very seriously. Chris, were you going to say a few words on the end here?
Yeah, exactly, Andrew. I think you said it quite well, and I think it fits very well with my colleagues from the engineering community in rail. I've been in the transportation sector for 15 plus years, and we all know, we all, let's say as a base element, we're engineers in the transportation industry and rail industry in particular. And it means that this type of technology fits very well with that mindset. And what I have found is many just were not aware that it existed in this level of maturity. They may have heard about a data diode. They may have heard about unidirectionality as kind of a, let's say, something someone did over there in the past, but it's very much matured now to the fact it aligns very well with where the discipline of cybersecurity and has moved, not only from a regulatory standpoint. You see this network segmentation and putting this idea of OT and IT rightfully front and center into the transportation sector, and a technology that has matured to the point that it has it can be deployed relatively quickly. And from a cost perspective, I would just simply generalize and say, take a serious look at the CapEx and the OpEx for taking a deterministic approach to cyber by design using this type of technology versus other types of technologies, including firewalls. I think if from a rail professional standpoint, we like to talk about total cost of ownership. We like to talk about CapEx and OpEx and a safety culture and deterministic behavior. All of this fits well with unidirectionality. And so I do appreciate that we're able to bring together the experience of Andrew Ginter today, as well as myself, to bring to the rail profession this valuable information about how to get ahead of the future threats that are unknown, capabilities that are unknown on an exponential curve that is clearly a problem on the cybersecurity side. So let's let the engineering discipline come back into the forefront and help manage this problem.
There you go. Daniela, thank you everyone for staying with us this long. We're a little bit over, but we're going to answer some of these questions that are in the queue. Daniela, do we have questions?
Yes, we do have a few questions. I just want to mention that it was a very informative session, and thank you both. Also, we will do our best to answer all questions. We will follow up on all questions and send a follow-up email to all registrants, including information on how to access a recorded version of this webinar for review or to share with others, as well as registration information for the upcoming webinars on other topics. I will read the first question. Years ago, I worked on the APTA cybersecurity standards. Are these still relevant? How do they relate to the TS 50701?
So Chris, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take this one. Hi, John. So I think at the most fundamental level, it's consistent with what you saw previously with the APTA standard in the sense of defining zones and thinking about the criticality of those zones and trying to pursue along the Purdue model an approach to cybersecurity. I think that might have been written in APTA maybe about at this point maybe 10 years ago. I can tell you that and working with APTA, I'm actually co-chair of the cybersecurity and new technologies business member group that's been stood up this past year in APTA, and my other colleague Scott Belcher is also co-chair. And what we are trying to do is build the latest update to the APTA standards that were there and have them be more consistent with and updated with some of the language that's coming from TS 5701, but also looking forward to where TS 5701 is going, which is a new IEC standard, which we are actively going to be working with APTA to contribute to. So I would say it was a lot of good work that was done even a decade ago there to try to acknowledge, and because it came from the safety culture, so there was already an acknowledgement of the need to have those segmented networks in zones, and you saw in TS 5701 that same kind of principled approach. It just in TS 5701 it became a little bit more, let's say, prescript in how to go about things and a little bit more detailed. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Chris. Next one. It is clear that two devices, unidirectional security gateway, will be needed to allow data from signaling to other systems and allow signaling to get power status from power systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is true. You may have seen, and we'll share this one, Andrew, because I think very good to see that on one of the slides you had seen the OCN actually sharing data back in to the SCN on one of those. And the fundamental point is that once you get down to the level of the protocol flows, you're able to look at those as two independent unidirectional streams, which means that you would not have from an untrusted network the ability to have any response back and have it have an actual loop. For example, you wouldn't necessarily see a bidirectional communication that would allow, for example, an external entity to be able to retrieve and see information as they try to laterally move in the network. So they are independent unidirectional streams. you want to elaborate as well, Andrew?
I'd like to, yeah. So let me point out that I agree with everything you said. I would also like to point out that most of the rail systems that are using unidirectional gateways today are using them, as you illustrated, Chris, at the IT/OT interface. How can both of these be true? If you look at the TS 50701 example, it had a very detailed sort of segmentation map as an example published in the standard. In practice, people put the gateways at the IT/OT interface, in my estimation, because they're reflecting the kind of concerns that the TSA has, which is keep operations running. Where's the truth? How many gateways belong in a design? What's an acceptable reference architecture for all of these networks working together? How do brownfields, differ from greenfields? This is something that, in my understanding, is still being worked out. Chris, you know much more about this than I do, but I just wanted to point out that there are options, and there's, generally a migration path available from, first steps to where we'd like to be in the long run.
Thank you. Does Waterfall have any information regarding directive for TSA aviation?
I can chime in. There was an announcement from the TSA saying that a security directive had been issued to important airports in the nation. I have not seen a copy of that. All I saw was the press release. I looked and nobody that I had contact with has seen a copy of this. I'm assuming it is confidential, like the original TSA pipeline directive, and it only went out to the affected airports. I'm not certain of that, but that is what it looks like. Chris, do you have any deeper knowledge on that?
This is exactly my understanding as well, Andrew. So the press release came out, and unlike the maturity of what Andrew had pointed out before, from oil and gas into rail, the struggle, I think, is that they wanted to copy over again and make applicable that maturity into the aviation sector, but it's a much more complicated environment. And so I think they are still trying to work through that. And from our understanding, that's exactly what they're trying to do is they carried through network segmentation and trying to describe the fact that, operations should still stay up if you're attacked on the IT side. So that principle still exists, but trying to lay that in the context of the aviation sector is still in the works with TSA. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, the press release was actually fairly detailed. And everything in the release was consistent, in my estimation, with a directive that looked a lot like the Rails directive, that looked a lot like the pipeline directive. This, the Rails and pipeline directives seem to be, the sense I have is that this is sort of becoming the standard way that the TSA views the world. And everything in the press release was consistent with that, but it was not a copy of the directive. So I can't swear that the directive is just like the Rails directive. It looked like it from the press release. That's all I can say. Do we have another question?
No, this is all the questions we have for now.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your answers. So we've reached the end of our hour, even a bit more. This was a great session. Thank you both. Please note that all unanswered questions will be followed up. Thank you all for participating in our webinar and submitting your questions. We look forward to seeing you again next time.
Yeah, so thank you, Chris. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, everyone joining us.
Yep. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Have a great day.